Nehf. I am a professor here and also Associate Dean for Graduate Studies here at the law school. And one of our speakers tonight is a graduate student and has really kind of organized this whole thing. That's Mohamed Arafa. But what I'm going to do tonight is just welcome you and introduce our speakers in the order in which they will speak. First up tonight, talking about really the events in Egypt, things that led up to it, the political situation there, is Frank Emmert, Dr. Frank Emmert, who most of you know. He's been a faculty member here as the John S. Grimes Professor of Law for many years. He has a PhD from University of Maastricht in the Netherlands. He directs our International and Comparative Law Center. He is the director of our LLM program in Egypt and has been since 2007. He has taught, spoken, published on an amazing variety of subjects all around the world. We're thankful he's here tonight. And then Swadish Kalsi will be speaking. He's been a long-time adjunct faculty member here at the law school. Swadish, in fact, I was just looking outside. He's been here for more than 20 years. His name is on a plaque as an adjunct faculty member. I hate to date you such, but he has a degree from the London School of Economics. He has a barrister's degree from Lincoln's Inn in London. He has an LLM degree from George Washington University. He practiced law in Kenya. Then he practiced law in Indiana. He was in general counsel's office at Cummins Engine. Then he was at Krieg Duval Law Firm in Indianapolis and has been teaching in our LLM program in Egypt for the last several years. In fact, I think he was there when the revolution broke. And we'll have some words to say about that. And then finally, Mohamed Arafa, our a graduate student, our SJD student, he's working on a dissertation here for the last couple of years. And the subject of his dissertation is apropos of tonight's discussion. He's focusing on the subject of bribery of public officials and corruption in public life, which of course has been in the news quite a bit lately, not only because of the events in Egypt, but throughout the Middle East. Mohamed has a law degree from Alexandria University in Egypt, an LLM degree from the University of Connecticut, and is on the faculty at Alexandria University. He's on leave while he's working on his dissertation here, and he's published on the subject of Islamic law and the law of corruption in many venues, and I think has an article coming out in our own International and Comparative Law Review. So with that, I will turn the program over to Frank Emmert, and what I think we'll do is have each of the speakers just speak briefly for 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions for the whole panel after that.
Thank you very much, Jim. Welcome to everyone. I think the arrangements are actually quite useful the way we have now sort of improvised things. I will give you a few opening statements, a bit of background information about the Middle East region, the countries there, their relevance, why does this all matter to us? And then we can go sort of into more specific issues with the subsequent speakers. I have to ask you, however, to understand that a lot of what we're going to do tonight is somewhat speculative. You know, we're talking about revolutions that are unfinished. In particular, the situation in Libya at this point in time is completely unpredictable. Basically, you open the New York Times from one day to the next, and one day the rebels are leading, and the next day the government is on top again. So what's going to happen in Libya is very hard to predict. The situation in Egypt has stabilized, at least to the point that we are able to resume our classes there. We have a faculty member over there right now. I myself will go at the end of this week. However, what's going to happen with the revolution there? Is it going to lead to a genuinely democratic government that will build a multi-party democracy that will be a contested democracy where the government really is doing and the people are doing what they're supposed to do in a democracy, namely hold each other accountable, that the people will reward a good government and replace a bad one in subsequent elections, that remains to be seen. So what we're doing here really is we're looking at a situation that is very much in flux. Even in Iran, we have a stable situation right now, but we also had demonstrations after the last elections, and you have to understand that much of what we say has to be taken with a grain of salt. Now, that being said, why are we here? What are we trying to do? Well, we're obviously analyzing current events. We're trying to put that somewhat in a historic context, in a political context, in an economic context, and then, of course, asking ourselves, what does that mean for us in the United States, for the West more broadly, but also more specifically for us in Indiana. We have seen a number of revolutionary changes of government in the Middle East. The first revolution was not even the one in Iran. I could go further back. In fact, we had a revolution in Egypt when the monarchy was replaced. But for our purposes, I think specifically when we're looking to compare a bit the situation in Iran, Egypt, and Libya, we don't have to go back further than 1979. Obviously, the Shah at that time was violently replaced by a new government, and that government essentially is still in power now. We'll talk a little bit more about the structures and features of the Iranian constitution and government. Most recently, of course, the events were triggered by a successful uprising in Tunisia, relatively swift, relatively bloodless, driven by a new generation of young, relatively educated people demanding democratic change. There is a video on YouTube that I did not bring, and it's also a little bit too long. It's about 10 minutes, but it's interesting. It was taken by the people who went into the palaces of President Ben Ali in Tunisia and opened the safes that he had in his palace. You have seen that video. It's interesting to see because there is safe after safe, and including bookshelves that then sort of like in the James Bond movies open up and reveal safes behind them with stacks of money, currency, in particular US dollars, euros, other currencies, and then also vaults and safes with jewelry and so on. Basically hundreds of millions of dollars in cash were found, and that was just what he couldn't carry out when he quickly had to leave the country. And that is indicative, and that's why I almost regret that I didn't bring this video to at least show you a few minutes of it. Indicative of why we have this situation in that part of the world. I was in one of the Shah's palaces when I was in Iran last year. And the kind of wealth that is displayed there, it's now a museum obviously, is unparalleled. We don't have that here. The White House is modest in comparison. And then you go across the street and you turn left and right twice and you are in a very poor neighborhood where people barely have running water and electricity, and that's Iran. That's one of the better places. And you have that in Tunisia, you have that obviously in more dramatic ways in Egypt. It's at this point unclear to what extent the Mubarak family looted in Egypt. I have seen a number of different pieces of information. There was a report in The Guardian that estimated their personal fortune in the $30 billion range. Then the Süddeutsche Zeitung in Germany went even higher into the $50 billion range. I don't know to what extent they have factual background for this. Ben Ali's family, he was married before he divorced his wife to marry his hairdresser, who came from obviously relatively modest backgrounds. Their fortunes have been relatively well assessed now. The wife, the former hairdresser, and her family accumulated about $12 billion. and he himself with his family is in charge of about 7 billion on a salary, an official salary in the range of $3,500, $4,000, $5,000. It's difficult to save up on that level. So we really know where the money is from, and it is to be feared that more information about the Mubarak family is going to come out, and it's also going to reveal, although Egypt is not a rich oil country, significant looting and stealing from the people. That's every billion that is in the hands of former dictators. There's many schools, many hospitals, many roads that were not built. Personally, I think nobody in their right mind can ever need more than about 250 million. Anything beyond that is just folly. The world record so far is held, to the best of our knowledge, by the Suharto family in Indonesia that accumulated and stole from their country about 70 billion. But I'm afraid this is going to be a contested record in the foreseeable future. Now, Gaddafi, we don't know much about his personal fortune yet, but given the fact that Libya is one of the major oil producers and has been for a long time, and if you are looking around in Egypt, in Libya, nothing much is to be seen of it, one wants to ask the question, where is all the money gone to? Now, we do know one direction where it did go, and that is to mercenaries that are currently fighting on behalf of Gaddafi. This is a significant part of the troops that are loyal to the government at the moment are not actually Libyans. These are people from other countries in Africa that obviously have been paid well and have been promised more, and that's why they are still there. Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the region, a lot of problems at the moment. The United States, if you have seen today's headlines in the New York Times, just shifted its position on Yemen from supporting the government because of its stance against Al-Qaeda to now encouraging the present leader to step down and step aside because we have realized that he is basically unsustainable. And this is a bit the issue that we have in the region, and this is coming back to my subject, the three revolutions compared. Of course, at the end, we're going to ask ourselves, is there a lesson to be learned? Iran, we thoroughly messed that up. We bet on the wrong horse, if you will, by supporting the Shah too long and thereby alienating everyone who came after. Are we going to learn from that? In Egypt, I think the United States are now more popular at the present time than they were before. What is going to happen country by country? We are being accused of hypocrisy by supporting the old structure in one place like Bahrain, and until this morning or until yesterday Yemen, and then siding with the rebels quickly in another country like Libya. Where is the consistency here? What are we really standing for? Are we standing for human rights and democracy, or are we standing for stability, or are we just standing for whatever seems to be opportune in American interests? Syria, we have some uprisings locally, but nothing very well organized, and the Syrian government has learned, apparently, President Assad is reading The Guardian, because there was a commentator early on in The Guardian who analyzed the situation after Tunisia had fallen and Egypt was in full swing, and said, well, what's the lesson? And he brought it down to two words: don't blink. The moment you show any sign of weakness, you're basically gone. And I think this is what Assad is currently doing. Anybody who dares to even congregate somewhere will simply be shot, and he's trying to keep it that way. And the press have already been banned from most parts of Syria, so that this can be done relatively quietly, because they also realized if we see it on CNN, then at some point we're going to send in the cruise missiles, if not the troops. What do the countries have in common? Well, obviously we have, first of all, predominantly Muslim populations. We had previously at least dictatorial, that means undemocratic leadership. We have widespread poverty in spite of widespread wealth, or at least abundant wealth. We have wealth even in a country like Egypt, although Egypt is structurally difficult. Tunisia has a relatively small population and good revenue from tourism and manufacturing in Tunisia. It doesn't spread to the poorer parts of the country. Egypt has a large population, I'll show you some statistics, but also revenue from various sources, including the Suez Canal, tourism and manufacturing, agricultural products from Egypt. And of course, most of the other countries just have a lot of oil. And when we look at who are the largest oil producers and then look at who are the most troubled countries and look also at where is the spread amongst the income the greatest, the poorest versus the richest people in the country, then we'll see a lot of links here, so that oil wealth is nowadays frequently considered a curse rather than a blessing. Of course, they also have important that they are strategic, they have in common that they're strategically important for us as oil producers. Our dependence on imported oil isn't going to go away anytime soon. Although we have started again with some efforts in this direction. President Obama has just announced that he wants to reduce our reliance on foreign oil by 1/3 over the next couple of years. Exactly how we're going to do that, he hasn't told us yet. But one thing you can take for granted, namely that the prices at the pump are only going to go in one direction in the foreseeable future. Shipping lanes, what we must not underestimate, 8% of world trade goes through the Suez Canal. This is significant. And then we have also the Cape of, what is the Somali Cape called in, with the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea. There are strategic shipping lanes. One is controlled essentially by Yemen. Of course, Egypt controlling the Suez Canal. If these countries, and I have been saying that in Egypt ever since we started the program, I've said to my students, to everyone who wanted to hear it, in my view, Egypt was sitting on the fence, and that our program there was one effort at trying to nudge it falling off that fence on the one side rather than the other. And the two sides were, is Egypt going to become another Iran, or is it becoming more like Turkey? Both countries are Muslim countries. Turkey obviously is relatively secular, relatively well-functioning democracy, has seen a fantastic economic growth rates in past years and is spreading the benefits of this economic growth more widely, whereas Iran is a fundamentalist Muslim country that is controlled by a handful of people, that is not genuinely democratic, although we will talk about that a little bit more as well. So this means we have reasons to be interested in these developments, in these governments, how they are evolving, because of the relevance for us as oil suppliers, for international trade, and of course also for their importance for peace in the Middle East and in particular around Israel. Another thing I have said many times before is that our program in Egypt should be funded by Israel at the end of the day. They have the largest interest in us promoting rule of law and pro-democratic evolution in Egypt. Now here is a view of the region. The darker green is the area traditionally considered the Middle East. Other countries are sometimes also taken into this definition. Other shaded here green countries. Now we could play a game whether everybody would be able to label all these countries, but we don't have to do that. I'm not even sure that I would be able by myself to do all of them correctly. This is what we are now focusing on, just to give you a bit of orientation here. Yemen, as you can see on the southern side of the Arabian Peninsula, then Bahrain, the country in the region that will run out of oil the first. I'm not entirely sure why the people are already demonstrating so far. They are relatively well off. But of course, the main reason for these demonstrations and these revolutions is not poverty. This is a feature that we'll talk about in Egypt in particular. These countries, other than what we have been talking about, of course, are also predominantly Muslim countries. You can see here the percentage of Muslims of the entire population. We have countries where the Muslim share is next to 100%, in particular Saudi Arabia, the entire Arabian Peninsula, Iraq, Iran. Iran constitutionally protects 4 religions. It's quite interesting. Zoroastrianism, which is the pre-Jewish religion, then Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and they consider these as a logical progression, with Islam being the most evolved, the most recent revelation, the most advanced religion. So we have these minorities in Iran. They are protected, they are able to practice their religion, but they are small. Egypt has somewhere between 10 and 15% Christian minority, the Coptic Christians, and it was interesting to see how Muslims and Christians in Egypt were standing together in this revolution. And efforts at dividing them and splitting them failed, at least in Tahrir Square and in the public fora. Whether this remains this way is to be hoped, but not entirely sure at this point in time. This is useless, I think, for you. Too small, and I'm not even going to dwell much on it. I have some of this data in a better format, I think, in a subsequent slide. This would give you information about land area, population size, and so on, but we don't have to spend time on this. Now, next, we'll look a bit at the oil. These countries are the ones with the largest oil reserves. I have that also in a table format in a moment. And you can see that we don't only have very large oil reserves in the Middle East, but of course the Canadian oil reserves are largely in oil sands and oil shale, not easily extractable. The Russian reserves are coming at a political price, and that is the same for all the others. Basically, you can say, except for Canada, all of these countries are not really where we should be sending an awful lot of money. If you look at oil reserves by region, you can see that more than half of all oil reserves are in fact in the Middle East. And that, of course, tells us something. As long as we are amongst the largest importers of oil and unable to stop that, we're going to have to deal with these governments in the Middle East, whether we like it or not. Now this hopefully will be somewhat legible because it is of some interest. The table is divided into 2. On the left side you have the largest producers. The latest data that was generally available was 2009. On the right side you have the largest proven reserves. Now if somebody is a big producer now, that can mean that they have large reserves, but it doesn't have to. They may actually be producing more than they should. For example, Russia, #1 producer right now, but only #8 in reserves altogether. Whereas, for example, Canada is only #7 in production right now because their oil is somewhat more expensive to extract, but #3 in overall reserves. You can see that Saudi Arabia in second place on both is, of course, going to be in this game for the long term. Interesting, what I didn't know, for example, that Egypt is not all that small. It's #29 as an oil producer and #27 in reserves. Egypt is actually exporting small quantities of oil and is otherwise self-sufficient, which is a great benefit for Egypt. It's not a major export. Now, what you cannot see on this slide very well, some of the countries are actually a bit gray shaded on the left side. These are the countries that have oil, but they're not sending a lot of it out because they need most of it themselves. And this is in particular the United States, China, increasingly Mexico isn't really such a significant exporter anymore. And then further down, the United Kingdom, obviously not really a big exporter anymore, and then Egypt. All the other countries tend to have more than they need, and therefore Brazil also not exporting very much. But all the others basically are either not using it because they have small populations, or not using it because they don't use a lot of oil, because they don't really drive a lot, and they don't really have a lot of industry that uses it. Nigeria, for example, has a large population, and if everybody in Nigeria would live as we live over here, then they wouldn't be exporting much. But since most Nigerians don't have cars and don't have many other things that we are accustomed to, a lot of the oil is actually sold internationally. You also have in the middle the population size, and you have two kinds of numbers. Here you have the rank internationally. This is the CIA fact book. They list about 220 jurisdictions or countries altogether. So you can see that the United States is the third largest population on the planet. China obviously in first place. India, by the way, in number 2. That's an easy guess, I think. And then it goes rapidly down. I didn't even look up what Qatar is. Qatar has only 0.8 million people, has the 14th largest oil reserves on the planet and the second largest natural gas reserves on the planet. Every Qatari is structurally a billionaire, and when you go there, then they let you feel that too, that they are very much aware of it. This is not a problem that we have in Egypt. The Egyptians are not rich, neither in absolute terms nor certainly in real terms in the population. So now let's talk something more interesting after this introductory remarks. Who and what is driving the revolutions? And I suggest that the trigger, you have push and pull factors, if you will. The push factors that were triggering the revolutions in all of these three countries are the same. And that is, you have despotic, self-serving dictators who use the state power to harass and suppress the people. And at some point, the people just have enough of it. It was somewhat less noticeable on the surface in Egypt and in Iran. However, if you look a bit closer, in particular, what we have seen and now know about Egypt, and my colleagues will elaborate this further. I'm sure that Mohamed will be able to supply more details. The police brutality, the random arrests, the suppression of any form of dissent, basically on the level of randomness. You never know why somebody was arrested, beaten up, or disappeared, and that intimidated everyone from staying